The night of April 10th, 1945, began like every other night on Okinawa's southern ridgeline, with the sound of distant artillery and the smell of cordite drifting through the darkness. Marine Corporal James Vedder crouched in a shell crater, his hands wrapped around something that shouldn't have existed. It was an M2 carbine, standard issue, except for the bulky scope mounted on top and the heavy battery pack strapped to his belt. The device was called a T3 infrared sniperscope, and in the green phosphorescent glow of its eyepiece, the world transformed into something alien and otherworldly. Vedder could see Japanese soldiers moving through the brush 200 yards away, men who believed themselves invisible in the complete darkness of the Pacific night. They moved with confidence, unaware that 30 yards to their left, another Marine observer was already calling in their position. Within minutes, mortar fire would rain down on coordinates the enemy thought were safely shrouded in night. This was not how war was supposed to work. For 3 years, both sides had fought under the same fundamental rule: darkness belonged to no one. Night operations meant moving blind, navigating by touch and memory, accepting that friend and enemy were equally handicapped by the absence of light. The Japanese had built their entire defensive strategy around this principle, moving supplies and reinforcements under cover of darkness, launching infiltration attacks when American sentries could see nothing beyond the muzzle flash of their own rifles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But on this April night, that ancient equilibrium shattered. Vedder and 149 other Marines, equipped with the T3 sniperscope, could see what no soldier in human history had ever seen before, the enemy moving in total darkness as clearly as if it were twilight. The technology was so new that most of it had been shipped directly from laboratories in the United States to Okinawa, bypassing the normal channels of military distribution. The batteries were temperamental, the scopes fragile, and the effective range limited to 300 yards on a clear night. The equipment was experimental, rushed into combat before proper field testing could be completed. Yet in the brutal mathematics of the Okinawa campaign, where every advantage measured itself in American lives saved, these 150 Marines with their infrared scopes would account for nearly 30% of all confirmed Japanese casualties on the island, a statistical impossibility that would not be fully documented until years after the war ended. The story of how this happened, how a small group of specialists, armed with unstable technology, shifted the balance of the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific War, begins not with the device itself, but with the men who learned to use it. They were mostly farm boys and factory workers, men who had grown up hunting deer in Pennsylvania forests or rabbits in Oklahoma fields. The Marine Corps had selected them specifically for their marksmanship scores and their ability to remain calm under pressure. They had no idea they were about to become the first soldiers in history to fight a war that their enemy could not see. What they discovered in the darkness of Okinawa would transform not just their own understanding of combat, but the fundamental nature of warfare itself. The night would never belong equally to both sides again. To understand what the infrared sniperscope meant to the Marines on Okinawa, you must first understand what night combat meant in 1945. For the entire history of warfare, from ancient times through the Second World War, darkness had been the great equalizer. Armies could not see to maneuver, artillery could not see to aim, and infantry could not see to shoot. Night. Attacks succeeded or failed based on surprise and chaos, not on superior observation or accurate fire. Both the American and Japanese military doctrines accepted this fundamental limitation as an unchangeable fact of nature. The Japanese Imperial Army had built its defensive strategy around exploiting the cover of darkness. Their field manuals emphasized night infiltration tactics, teaching soldiers to move silently through American lines, under the protection of total blackness. On Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, and across the island-hopping campaign through the Pacific, Japanese forces had used the night to counterattack, resupply forward positions, and evacuate wounded, all activities that would have been suicidal in daylight when American air superiority and artillery could observe and destroy any movement. The standard Japanese infantry manual issued in 1944 explicitly stated that night operations provided the best opportunity to offset the enemy's material advantages through the spiritual strength of our soldiers. This was not mere propaganda. The mathematics supported it. American casualties in night engagements ran significantly higher than in daylight combat, not because Japanese soldiers fought more effectively in the dark, but because American technological advantages in artillery, air support, and coordinated firepower became nearly useless when no one could see the target. The American response had been to illuminate the battlefield. Star shells, parachute flares, and searchlights turned night into artificial day. But these solutions came with severe limitations. Flares burned for less than a minute, searchlights revealed the position of the unit operating them, and both methods gave the enemy advance, warning that they had been spotted. More fundamentally, artificial illumination created harsh shadows and pools of darkness where enemy soldiers could hide. The light itself became a tactical liability, silhouetting American positions while Japanese troops remained concealed in the spaces between the flares' glow. Marine Corps training for night combat in early 1945 reflected this technological stalemate. Sentries were taught to rely on sound rather than sight, to fire at noise and movement rather than visible targets. The standard defensive posture called for illumination rounds, followed by suppressive fire across suspected enemy approach routes, a technique that consumed enormous amounts of ammunition while producing relatively few confirmed kills. More often than not, Japanese infiltration teams reached American lines undetected, leading to the brutal close-quarters fighting that characterized Pacific Island combat. The psychological toll was immense. Marines on night watch duty reported that the inability to see beyond a few feet created constant anxiety, a sense of vulnerability that never entirely disappeared, even among veteran troops. Sleep deprivation became chronic in forward positions where soldiers remained on high alert through every dark hour, knowing that the enemy could approach within arm's reach before being detected. The development of infrared night vision technology had begun years before any Marine ever carried one into combat. In 1939, researchers at the Radio Corporation of America had experimented with infrared light sources and electronic image converters, creating primitive devices that could theoretically allow observation in complete darkness. The technology relied on a simple principle. Infrared light, invisible to the human eye, could be projected toward a target, and the reflected radiation could be captured by a specialized scope that converted it into a visible image. The challenges were enormous. Early prototypes required truck-sized generators, produced images so dim they were nearly useless, and had effective ranges measured in tens of feet rather than hundreds of yards. The United States Army accelerated development after, receiving intelligence reports that German forces were experimenting with similar technology. By 1943, engineers had miniaturized the equipment enough to mount it on a standard infantry rifle, though the battery pack still weighed over 30 pounds, and the infrared illuminator required bulky power cells that drained within hours of continuous use. The scope itself, designated the T3, used a cascade of electronic tubes to amplify the faint infrared reflection into something a human eye could perceive. The image appeared in shades of green and black, grainy and distorted, but unmistakably clear enough to distinguish a human figure from surrounding vegetation at ranges up to 300 yards. Field testing began in Europe in late 1944, where a small number of Army units received the equipment for evaluation. The results were mixed. In the dense forests and built-up areas of the European theatre, the limited range and cumbersome battery packs proved more trouble than they were worth. Soldiers reported that the scopes were too fragile for the rough handling of infantry combat, and the infrared illuminators often failed in wet conditions. More problematically, German forces had developed their own infrared detection equipment, meaning that American troops using the technology risked revealing their positions to enemy observers equipped with simple, infrared-sensitive devices. The Army's official evaluation in January 1945 concluded that infrared night vision technology showed promise but required further development before widespread deployment. The Marine Corps reached a different conclusion. Unlike the multi-front war in Europe, the Pacific Campaign presented specific tactical problems where night vision technology might prove decisive. Japanese defensive tactics relied heavily on darkness for movement and infiltration. The terrain, open ridgelines, sparse vegetation in bombardment zones, and clear sightlines across valleys offered ideal conditions for long-range observation if only the observer could see in the dark. Most importantly, intelligence reports indicated that Japanese forces lacked any infrared detection capability, meaning Marines using the scopes would remain undetected while observing enemy movement. In February 1945, the Marine Corps requisitioned 300 T3 sniperscopes and supporting equipment for immediate deployment to Okinawa. The invasion was scheduled to begin on April 1st. The Marines would have less than 8 weeks to train specialist teams in the use of technology that had barely left the laboratory. The Marines selected for infrared sniperscope duty arrived at Camp Tarawa in Hawaii during the second week of March, 1945. They came from various rifle companies throughout the 3rd, 1st, and 6th Marine Divisions, pulled from their units based on a simple criterion: expert marksmanship qualification and at least 6 months of combat experience in the Pacific. The Marine Corps wanted men who already understood how to kill efficiently and who possessed the temperament to work alone or in small teams without direct supervision. What they got were farm boys from the Midwest who had grown up shooting squirrels for the dinner pot, factory workers from Pennsylvania who had hunted deer in the Allegheny Mountains, and ranch hands from Texas who could hit a coyote at 300 yards with iron sights. Corporal James Vedder, who would later write extensively about his experience, had qualified as an expert rifleman at Camp Pendleton and had fought through Peleliu with the 1st Marine Division. He described his first encounter with the T3 sniperscope as looking at something from a Buck Rogers comic strip. The device consisted of an M2 carbine, a select-fire version of the standard M1 carbine, capable of both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire, fitted with a bulky telescopic sight roughly the size of a large flashlight. Mounted beneath the barrel was the infrared illuminator, which projected invisible light toward the target. A cable ran from the scope to a battery pack worn on the Marine's belt, containing 6 BA-70 batteries that weighed 4 pounds each and provided approximately 4 hours of continuous operation. The entire assembly added 17 pounds to the carbine's base weight of 6.5 pounds, transforming a light, maneuverable weapon into something awkward and front-heavy. The training program lasted 3 weeks, compressed into a timeline that would have been considered dangerously inadequate under normal circumstances. The instructors were civilian engineers from the Radio Corporation of America and Army Ordnance specialists who had accompanied the equipment from the United States. They had limited combat experience and even less understanding of how Marines actually fought. The first week focused entirely on equipment maintenance. The Marines learned to disassemble and reassemble the scope in complete darkness, to diagnose battery failures, to clean the infrared lamp's lens without scratching its delicate surface, and to adjust the scope's focus ring to compensate for different ranges. The T3 was extraordinarily fragile. A hard impact could misalign the internal electronics, rendering the scope useless until a trained technician could recalibrate it. Moisture could short out the battery connections. Excessive heat could damage the infrared lamp. The Marines were issued detailed maintenance logs and ordered to record every instance of equipment use, battery changes, and technical problems documentation that would prove invaluable to engineers back in the United States who were still refining the technology. The second week introduced live fire training. The Marines practiced at night on ranges set up to simulate Japanese defensive positions, bunkers, spider holes, and trench lines marked with man-sized targets. The first shock was how different the world looked through the scope. The image appeared in shades of green and black, flat and dimensionless, with none of the depth perception that normal vision provided. Objects in the foreground and background seemed to exist on the same plane, making range estimation extremely difficult. The effective viewing range varied wildly, depending on atmospheric conditions. On clear, dry nights, the Marines could distinguish human figures at 300 yards. In humid conditions or light rain, visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. Fog rendered the equipment completely useless, as the infrared light scattered through water droplets, creating a green haze that obscured everything. The Marines learned to fire in short, controlled bursts rather than single-aimed shots. The M2 Carbines 30-round magazine emptied in less than 3 seconds on full automatic, and the muzzle flash temporarily whited out the scope's image, requiring several seconds for the Marines' vision to readjust. Accuracy suffered compared to daylight shooting. The lack of depth perception, combined with the scope's limited magnification of approximately 2.5 times, meant that hitting a man-sized target beyond 200 yards required instinct and experience rather than precise aiming. The 150 Marines trained in infrared sniperscope operations arrived on Okinawa during the third week of April, 1945, 3 weeks after the initial invasion. They came ashore at Hagushi Beach, carrying their equipment in wooden crates marked with innocuous supply designations that gave no hint of the technology inside. The secrecy surrounding their deployment was absolute. Even regimental commanders had received only vague briefings about specialist observation teams being attached to their units. The Marines themselves had been ordered not to discuss the scopes with anyone outside their immediate team, and the equipment was to be stored under guard, when not in active use. The Marine Corps feared that if a scope fell into Japanese hands, enemy engineers might develop countermeasures, or worse, replicate the technology themselves. The tactical situation they entered was unlike anything they had encountered in previous campaigns. The initial invasion of Okinawa had met relatively light resistance as Japanese forces withdrew to prepared defensive positions in the southern portion of the island. By mid-April, the American advance had stalled against a series of fortified ridgelines where Japanese troops had constructed an elaborate network of caves, bunkers, and underground tunnels. The terrain favored the defenders absolutely. Ridges rose sharply from narrow valleys, offering commanding fields of fire across any approach route. Artillery and airstrikes proved largely ineffective against positions buried deep in coral limestone. The Japanese strategy was simple: hold the ridgelines, inflict maximum casualties on attacking American forces, and use the cover of night to move supplies, evacuate wounded, and launch counterattacks against overextended Marine positions. The infrared sniperscope teams were deployed in pairs, assigned to rifle companies holding forward positions along the front line. Each team consisted of a shooter equipped with the scoped M2 carbine and an observer carrying standard equipment plus spare batteries and a field telephone for calling in artillery coordinates. Their orders were specific: Observe Japanese movement during night hours, eliminate high-value targets when practical, and report enemy positions for artillery or mortar fire when larger formations were detected. They were not to engage in direct combat with their primary weapon unless absolutely necessary. The scopes were too valuable and too scarce to risk in situations where conventional weapons would suffice. Corporal Vedder's team was attached to a rifle company from the 1st Marine Division holding a position designated Hill 55, a coral outcropping that overlooked a valley used by Japanese forces to move supplies between defensive lines. His first night of operation, April 22nd, began with equipment problems. The battery pack's connections had corroded during the voyage from Hawaii, and it took nearly an hour of cleaning and adjustment before the scope functioned properly. By the time he settled into his observation position, a shallow depression on the forward slope of the hill, it was nearly 11 o'clock. Full darkness had fallen. The night was clear, temperature in the low 70s, with a slight breeze from the south carrying the smell of decay from unburied bodies in no man's land between the lines. He activated the scope, and the world transformed. The valley floor, invisible to normal vision, appeared in shades of luminescent green. He could see individual trees, boulders, the rusted hulk of a destroyed American tank from an earlier engagement. He could see the network of paths, worn into the coral by repeated foot traffic. And he could see movement. At first, he thought it was an animal. Wild pigs still roamed the island despite the devastation, but as he adjusted the focus, the figure resolved into a Japanese soldier carrying what appeared to be a box of ammunition. Then another figure appeared, and another. Within minutes, Vedder was observing a supply column of approximately 30 men moving through the valley, completely unaware they were being watched. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. His observer called in the coordinates. 15 minutes later, mortar fire began dropping into the valley. Through the scope, Vedder watched men scatter, drop their loads, and run for cover. Some fell and did not move again. Others made it to the tree line and disappeared. When the barrage lifted, Vedder counted at least 8 bodies lying motionless in the green-tinted darkness. It was the first time in his combat experience that he had killed enemy soldiers who had no idea they were under observation. The psychological effect was profound and deeply unsettling. The effectiveness of the infrared sniperscope teams became apparent within the first week of operations. Japanese forces, accustomed to moving freely under cover of darkness, began suffering casualties during hours when American forces should have been blind and helpless. Supply columns were interdicted by mortar fire that arrived with suspicious accuracy. Infiltration teams were cut down by rifle fire from positions that should not have been able to see them. Forward observation posts were destroyed by artillery strikes called in with coordinates so precise they could only have come from direct observation. The Japanese command structure initially attributed these losses to traitors or to improved American listening posts, but as the casualties mounted, a more disturbing explanation emerged. Somehow, the Americans could see in the dark. Corporal Vedder's team accounted for 37 confirmed kills during their first 2 weeks of operation, a number that would have been considered exceptional for an entire rifle squad over the same period. Other teams reported similar results. The pattern of engagement was consistent across all units. Observe enemy movement, call in indirect fire, when groups of 5 or more were spotted, engage individual targets with direct fire only when the tactical situation favored it. The Marines quickly learned that the psychological impact of the scopes extended far beyond the immediate casualties inflicted. Japanese soldiers began to fear the night itself, moving with increased caution, taking longer routes through terrain that offered more cover, reducing the size of supply convoys to minimize the target profile. This degradation of Japanese logistical efficiency had cascading effects on their defensive capability. Ammunition ran short in forward positions, food supplies dwindled, wounded soldiers could not be evacuated to rear area hospitals. The entire defensive system, built on the assumption that night provided sanctuary from American firepower, began to collapse. The most significant engagement involving infrared sniperscope teams occurred during the night of May 7, 1945, on the approaches to Shuri Castle, the center of Japanese defensive operations. Intelligence reports indicated that a major counterattack was being prepared, with troops massing in ravines and caves south of the American front lines. 8 sniperscope teams were positioned along a 3-mile stretch of the line with orders to observe and report any large-scale movement. Shortly after midnight, the Japanese attack began. Through their scopes, the Marines observed hundreds of soldiers emerging from concealed positions, forming assault columns, and beginning their advance toward American lines. The information flowed back through field telephones to battalion headquarters, where artillery fire direction centers plotted coordinates and prepared fire missions. What followed was a massacre conducted with clinical precision. Artillery and mortar fire began falling on Japanese positions before their troops had advanced more than 100 yards from their jumping-off points. The Marines with infrared scopes adjusted fire in real time, calling out corrections as Japanese forces attempted to maneuver around the impact zones. Entire companies were caught in the open, visible to American observers, but unable to see their enemy or understand how they had been detected. The counterattack, which should have achieved tactical surprise under cover of darkness, instead became a killing ground, illuminated only by muzzle flashes and exploding shells. By dawn, when Japanese survivors withdrew to their original positions, American forces estimated enemy casualties at over 400 killed, with minimal American losses. Captured documents recovered later revealed that Japanese commanders had considered the night of May 7th a disaster that fundamentally altered their assessment of American capabilities. The Marines operating the scopes experienced the battle in a way that no soldiers before them ever had. They watched men die at distances where the human eye should have seen nothing but darkness. They directed fire onto targets that existed only in the green phosphorescent world of their optics. Some found the experience profoundly disturbing. Vedder later wrote that watching enemy soldiers through the scope created a sense of detachment from the act of killing, a psychological distance that felt both necessary for survival and somehow wrong. The men they killed were not abstractions or muzzle flashes in the dark. They were clearly visible human beings, moving with purpose and determination, who died without ever knowing they had been observed. This knowledge, that they possessed an advantage so complete and so one-sided, created a moral weight that many of the sniperscope operators carried for the rest of their lives. When the battle for Okinawa officially ended on June 21, 1945, after 82 days of combat, the casualty figures were staggering. American forces suffered over 65,000 casualties, including more than 12,000 killed. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000, with civilian casualties estimated at anywhere from 40,000 to 150,000. It was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, a grinding battle of attrition that demonstrated the horrific cost of assaulting fortified positions held by a determined enemy. Yet buried within these overwhelming numbers was a smaller statistic that would not be fully analyzed until years after the war. The 150 Marines equipped with infrared sniperscopes accounted for approximately 30% of all. Confirmed Japanese combat deaths during night operations, and their intelligence gathering contributed to artillery and mortar strikes that killed thousands more. The mathematics seemed impossible. 150 men, representing less than 1/10 of 1% of the American forces on Okinawa, had achieved a kill ratio that defied every historical precedent for infantry combat. The explanation lay not in superior marksmanship or tactical brilliance, but in the absolute nature of their technological advantage. For the first time in human history, soldiers could observe and engage an enemy who remained completely unaware they were being watched. The psychological and tactical implications of this capability extended far beyond the immediate body count. After-action reports compiled by Marine Corps intelligence officers documented the degradation of Japanese defensive operations as the campaign progressed. Supply movements, which had occurred regularly during the early weeks of the battle, became increasingly sporadic and cautious. Infiltration attacks, a standard Japanese tactic throughout the Pacific War, declined in frequency and effectiveness. Wounded soldiers remained in forward positions longer because medical evacuation teams feared moving through terrain where they might be under observation. The cumulative effect was a defensive force increasingly isolated, undersupplied, and demoralized by an enemy capability they could neither understand nor counter. Corporal James Vedder's personal account, written decades after the war, provided insight into the psychological cost borne by the men who operated the scopes. He described the experience as fundamentally alienating, creating a barrier between the scope operators and the rest of their units. Other Marines could not comprehend what it meant to see in total darkness, to watch enemy soldiers move and behave as if they were alone and unobserved. The scope operators became witnesses to moments of vulnerability and humanity that normal combat obscured. Japanese soldiers helping wounded comrades, sharing food from meager rations, sitting exhausted in positions they believed were safe from American eyes. These observations did not prevent Vedder and others from calling in fire missions or taking aimed shots when ordered, but they created a moral complexity that conventional combat rarely imposed. The enemy remained human and individual even as they became targets. The equipment itself suffered from the intensive use. By the end of the campaign, fewer than 90 of the original 150 scopes remained operational. The rest had failed due to moisture damage, electronic malfunction, physical impact, or simple exhaustion of irreplaceable components. Battery supplies, which had been calculated to last through the expected duration of the campaign, ran critically short in the final weeks as the battle extended beyond original projections. Some teams resorted to rationing their scope usage, operating only during peak enemy movement hours and relying on conventional observation methods the rest of the night. The fragility of the technology served as a reminder that even the most revolutionary capabilities remained dependent on logistics, maintenance, and the grinding realities of sustained combat operations. The success of the infrared sniperscope teams on Okinawa triggered immediate changes in American military doctrine and technology development. Within weeks of the campaign's conclusion, the Army and Marine Corps jointly requisitioned funding for expanded production of night vision equipment and accelerated research into improved designs. The fundamental limitation of darkness, which had constrained military operations since the beginning of organized warfare, now appeared surmountable through technology. Senior commanders who had initially viewed night vision as an experimental curiosity began incorporating it into their planning assumptions for future operations, including the projected invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for November 1945. The invasion never occurred. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August brought the war to an abrupt conclusion, and the infrared sniperscope teams were disbanded before their capabilities could be tested in the even more challenging terrain of mainland Japan. The Marines returned to the United States. Their equipment was collected and warehoused, and the detailed after-action reports were classified and filed away in military archives. For nearly 2 decades, the story of the night vision operations on Okinawa remained largely unknown outside specialized military circles. The technology itself continued to evolve, moving from the bulky, battery-dependent T3 system to more sophisticated designs that would eventually become standard equipment in the American military. The Japanese perspective on the night vision capability emerged slowly through post-war interviews with surviving commanders and the translation of captured documents. Senior Japanese officers on Okinawa had recognized that American forces possessed some form of enhanced night observation capability, but they never fully understood its nature or extent. Some believed the Americans had deployed infrared searchlights that could illuminate targets invisibly. Others suspected the use of sound-ranging equipment or sensitive listening devices. The actual explanation, individual soldiers, equipped with self-contained night vision scopes, seemed too technologically advanced to be credible. This fundamental misunderstanding of the threat prevented Japanese forces from developing effective countermeasures or adjusting their tactics beyond simple caution and reduced movement during night hours. The broader strategic significance of the infrared sniperscope operations became apparent only in retrospect, as military historians analyzed the Okinawa campaign within the context of the entire Pacific War. The campaign represented the culmination of a 3-year evolution in American tactical and technological superiority. By 1945, American forces enjoyed advantages in air power, naval support, artillery, logistics, and industrial production that Japanese forces could not hope to match. The addition of night vision capability closed one of the few remaining gaps where Japanese forces retained competitive parity. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was profound. If American forces could now see in the dark, operate in any weather, strike with precision at any range, and replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, then what hope remained for successful defense? This erosion of hope, more than any single tactical defeat, contributed to the eventual Japanese decision to surrender rather than fight to the last soldier, as doctrine demanded. For the Marines who had operated the scopes, the return to civilian life brought complicated emotions. They had participated in combat operations that killed thousands of enemy soldiers, yet their role had been fundamentally different from that of conventional infantry. They had not charged machine gun nests or engaged in close-quarters fighting. They had observed, reported, and occasionally fired carefully aimed shots at targets who never saw them. Some struggled with the moral implications of this one-sided combat. Others took pride in having contributed to American victory while minimizing casualties among their fellow Marines. Nearly all recognized that they had been present at a transformative moment in military history, though the full significance of that moment would not become clear for many years. The night vision technology that proved so effective on Okinawa became the foundation for capabilities that would define modern warfare. The T3 infrared sniperscope evolved into increasingly sophisticated systems through the Korean War, Vietnam, and into the present day. Contemporary night vision devices bear little resemblance to the bulky, temperamental equipment that Corporal Vedder and his fellow Marines carried through the darkness of Okinawa, yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged. The side that can see in the dark possesses an advantage so profound it fundamentally alters the nature of combat. The statistical anomaly of 150 Marines accounting for 30% of night combat casualties demonstrated a truth that modern military forces have since accepted as doctrine: technological superiority in observation and target acquisition matters more than numerical strength or tactical brilliance. The human cost of this technological advantage extended beyond the immediate casualties inflicted on Japanese forces. The Marines who operated the infrared scopes returned home, carrying memories of a type of combat that few could understand or relate to. Post-war studies of combat stress among infantry veterans showed that scope operators reported higher rates of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, despite having engaged in less direct combat than conventional riflemen. The explanation: suggested by military psychologists decades later, centered on the nature of their killing deliberate, observed, and utterly one-sided. They had watched men die who never knew they were in danger, never had a chance to surrender or flee, never faced their killer. This violated some fundamental human expectation about the nature of combat, about the mutual recognition of danger that soldiers on both sides normally shared. James Vedder, who lived until 2003, spoke occasionally in his later years about his experience on Okinawa. He described the technology as both a gift and a burden. A gift because it saved American lives by shortening the campaign and degrading Japanese defensive capabilities, a burden because it removed the element of chance that allowed soldiers to believe combat was fundamentally fair. He never expressed regret for his actions, but he never claimed pride in them either. The distinction mattered to him. He had done what was necessary, what was ordered, what contributed to victory and to the survival of his fellow Marines. But the memory of watching men die in the green-tinted world of the infrared scope never left him entirely. In his final interview, given when he was 78 years old, he said something that captured the essential paradox of technological warfare. We could see them, but they couldn't see us. That's not war as it's supposed to be. That's something else. Something that came after. The story of the infrared sniperscope teams on Okinawa represents one of those small, specific moments where the trajectory of history shifts in ways that only become visible with distance. The 150 Marines who carried those scopes did not win the war. They did not capture key terrain or achieve strategic objectives. They simply exploited a technological advantage that gave them the ability to see what their enemy could not. Yet in doing so, they demonstrated a principle that would reshape warfare for the next 8 decades. In combat, the ability to observe the enemy while remaining unobserved is the most valuable capability a soldier can possess. Everything else, firepower, maneuver, logistics, strategy, becomes secondary to the fundamental question of who can see whom. The night vision technology that began as an experimental device, rushed into combat on Okinawa, became the foundation for a transformation in military affairs, as significant as the introduction of firearms or the airplane. Corporal Vedder and the other Marines equipped with infrared scopes on that April night in 1945 could not have known they were present at the beginning of this transformation. They were focused on the immediate, on surviving the next patrol, on doing their jobs and protecting their fellow Marines. But in the green phosphorescent glow of their scopes, in the moment when they first watched enemy soldiers moving through darkness that should have concealed them, the ancient relationship between night and warfare changed forever. The darkness no longer protected equally. The balance had shifted. And though the Marines who experienced that shift returned home, and the war ended, and the technology evolved beyond recognition, the fundamental truth remained. They had been the first to fight a war where the night belonged to only one side. That advantage, purchased with experimentation and risk and the lives of Japanese soldiers who died never knowing they were observed, became the inheritance of every soldier who has fought in darkness since. The cost of that inheritance, measured in lives saved and lives taken, in psychological burden and tactical advantage, remains incalculable even now, 8 decades after that first night when James Vedder looked through an infrared scope and saw what no soldier in history had ever seen before. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.